So you know that you need a podcast intro for your podcast, but you have absolutely no idea where to start. I mean, what do you even say in a podcast intro? If you've ever had this conversation with yourself, you're in the right place, because in this video, I'm going to give you some ideas on how to start activating some ideas for what's possible. Also, some examples of what a podcast intro should sound like. Let's get started. The goal of a podcast intro is to welcome people to your podcast episode. A podcast intro goes on the beginning of every podcast episode, or at least should, and then an outro would go on the end of your podcast episode. For demonstration purposes, in this video, I'm going to be specifically talking about a podcast intro. If you've ever listened to a podcast episode, which I recommend that you do if you're not currently a podcast consumer, because this will give you a really good idea of the different types of intros that are available on podcasts today. Now, no intro is created the same because, well, your podcast is yours and mine is mine. The idea is to get people excited, to educate, to motivate, and to differentiate in 20 seconds or less so that people anticipate what's to come on the podcast episode. But more importantly, helping them better understand what the podcast is all about before diving into the podcast episode. So I'm going to give you a couple different examples of what's possible with creating a podcast intro script for your podcast. All right, so this is not going to be a tutorial on how to actually go in and craft an intro. It's going to be information on what an intro should actually say. So I just want to give that quick hashtag disclosure real quick that there are other videos here on the channel. All you simply do is type in podcast intro. I've done several videos on hacks and being able to actually create a podcast intro, in addition to being able to actually open up GarageBand or Audacity and create your own. But for the purposes of this video, I just want to talk about what's possible when you're creating an intro script for your podcast. Now, you don't have to give an entire dissertation and explanation of what your podcast is going to be all about in your intro. That can be saved for more of the description of your podcast that you type in on your podcast host, so that when people find your podcast, they read the description and go, oh, this is what the podcast is all about. Usually that's a pretty common practice for people to do when they find a new podcast, in addition to, well, pressing play. So your intro should educate, motivate, and differentiate what your show is all about. Welcome to my podcast. This is a show about fill in the blank. We're here to fill in the blank. Let's get started. It can be that simple. Can also be somewhat informative, but not too much. I always say the sweet spot for intros is between 20 and 25 seconds max. As time progresses, I'm seeing intros becoming shorter and shorter because it is questionable on whether or not returning listeners do actually listen to the entire intro of a podcast. Now, for new people finding the podcast, it's very important to have an intro on there. That's why we include intros and outros on the podcast. But one thing you don't want to do when creating your podcast intro is talk about the entire bio of your guest on the intro. That's going to be reserved for maybe just a little snippet that can be added before the episode after the intro that says, hey, my guest this week, Jane Smith, does this, that, and the other, and I'm really excited to chat with her. Let's welcome Jane to the show. So something like that is totally cool. What's not cool, in my opinion, is going through and reading, hi, Jane went to college here, and she does this, and she accomplished that, and I'm really excited to talk to her because she's going to talk about this. What that does is just take steam out of the conversation you're going to have with the interview. So save it for the interview. An intro bumper is a completely different video. So I want to stay on track with what we're talking about here with a podcast intro. Now, it's not uncommon to just have some really exciting music or music of your taste or your liking on your podcast intro. In the podcast intro, simply having music play for a couple of seconds and then saying, welcome to my podcast. And then music plays a little bit more and says, and here's your host, Billy. It's not uncommon to not say a lot in a podcast intro. In fact, in my opinion, less is more. But a lot of people come from the school of, I need to help people understand, in addition to welcoming them to the podcast episode, I want to help them better understand what the show is actually all about. If you go back and look at some other videos on the channel here, I've played a lot of podcast intro examples of shows that we've launched here at the Podcast Launch Lab, in addition to my own podcast from Beyond the Story. Mine doesn't say a lot. I give a little blurb about welcome to Beyond the Story podcast, a podcast that goes way beyond the story. And then my buddy, who's an NBA PA announcer, says, and now Sebastian Rusk, and the music starts to play, and then it fades, and the episode starts. You can go take a listen at any episode on the Beyond the Story podcast.com website. But that's an example of what's possible. So if you're racking your brain, you're like, I really don't want to say a lot in a podcast intro. You don't need to. Less is more. But if you've scripted out, we have each of our clients here at the Podcast Launch Lab create a script for their intro and their outro. So they at least have something in front of them that they can read when they're recording it. That's also one of the things that we work on with them, is developing that script, because it's not always the easiest thing to be able to sit down, put a pen to paper, and script out what you want your podcast intro to say. But what I always like to encourage people to do is like an elevator pitch. So if you're in an elevator for 30 seconds and you've got 30 seconds to explain what you do, what do you say? If you're at a networking event and someone says, what do you do? What do you say? Same rule applies for your podcast. So you want to have that introduction, that welcoming, exciting feeling or component. You want that elevator pitch moment. This is what the podcast is all about, and this is why we're doing it. And then be able to parlay that into the excitement of getting the episode started by saying, and now here's your host, and now please welcome Jimmy, whatever it might be, whatever it is based on your preferences. There are no rules when it comes with a podcast, when it comes to a podcast intro or an outro. The only rules are you don't want too much, because people just tune that out. If you keep it under 20 seconds, it's going to be quick, it's going to be to the point, and it's going to help people, number one, feel welcome to the episode, give them an idea, 2 cents on what the episode or the podcast is all about, and then it's going to welcome the host. And that is the purpose of a podcast intro. Well, I hope you're leaving this video knowing at least one or two things that you did not know about creating an intro script for your podcast intro. That's quite the tongue twister there. A lot of people don't know what to actually say, let alone creating a podcast intro for their podcast. So if you're curious on how to actually create one, you want to hear some examples of podcast intros, take a look at the other videos on the channel here. Just simply search podcast intro or check out the podcast intro playlist, and there's an entire library there. Any questions, thoughts, ideas, feedback on this video or any video on the channel, please leave a comment below. I do respond to each and every one of you lovely individuals. Until next time.